to discuss in our group, and not so much me talking about it. Are we beginning to develop, or is there any sense in which we can speak of a Christian, genuinely Christian sense of personality development? Or is there a Christian idea of development in personality? And just to get us going in that discussion, let me begin with just a very small few minutes presentation. The first thought is, when we devised this project, we looked at different topics that might be interesting for Christian theologians and Christian philosophers, or philosophers and theologians who work on Christian topics. And it seemed to us that character development, personality development would be a topic that would be interesting for Christian scholars. But then when we tried to spell it out, and we did try to spell it out in our initial application to Templeton, it turned out that this initial hunch we had, the initial idea, is not easy to spell out, because there are so many different ways of possibly spelling it out. And I'll give you a few, and then I would like to hear from you what you think, and so that we learn from each other. So there is a trend in psychology and also in philosophy to think that personality development or personality growth is a kind of integration of different modules or systems of the psyche. So, and many authors actually, beginning with Freud, that your Es and Über-Ich somehow have to become integrated, reality principle, the ego has to become strong, all the way to PSI, which we learned about last time, or discussed last time, learned about earlier, in which the more integrated the different personality systems are, the more developed your personality is. Or in a Harry Frankfurt kind of philosophical psychology, an autonomous, mature person is able to integrate realm of first order volitions and second order volitions. So I really want what I want to want. So there's a whole whole class of models that personality growth is really integration of different aspects or different systems of the psyche, very often the subconscious and the conscious. System 1, System 2, or even in Carl Gustav Jung, integration of the anima. Is there anything along those lines that's typically Christian? That's my first question. Then the second topic, which is obvious, is that a Christian might answer to the question whether there is a typical Christian sense of personality growth. By personality growth, I mean development, growth in virtue. And then you can give certain lists of virtues. And that's actually that has happened, even though it seems to be non-empirical, and it seems to be importing normative concepts into an empirical science. But if you look at positive psychology in recent years, that's really what happened. They developed catalogs of virtues, and they take them partially from classical Aristotelian philosophy. And the other question would be, are there any genuine Christian virtues by which we could measure personality growth, so that certain gifts of the Holy Spirit, for example, an old tradition, become more prominent in a person? something like this. So that's the second model. The first one is integration. The second one is virtue development. And the third one is finding your true self. Growth is meaning to find your true self, which again is a very philosophical idea in Kierkegaard and others, existentialist philosophers, which then more or less directly from Kierkegaard had influence on humanistic psychology. Carl Rogers even often quotes Kierkegaard when he talks about these things. In the Christian tradition, the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which were extremely important for the Catholic tradition in the last 500 years, are a model of finding yourself. And it follows a certain methodological or a certain method of 4 weeks or 4 segments. And the first one is you face your demons, you face the dark sides of your psyche, the things that you normally hide from yourself and others. That's the first week. Then the second week, you try to make a decision about what you really want to become in your life. Then there's a certain method how to do this. The third part of the process is you try to do this to live that ideal which you had chosen in the second step, and you fail. That's the experience of the cross and suffering. So your idealism basically shatters when being brought in contact with reality. And then in the fourth step of the spiritual exercises, you give up your ego and commit yourself or give yourself completely over to God. It's no longer about my will, my understanding, my freedom. Just give me your love and that's enough. It's an almost mystical step then. And the claim is that true Christian development follows exactly those 4 steps. And that has become in many different ways very influential. And that's the third one. The first one was integration. Second one, virtue development. The third one, finding your true self. I can also share, if that helps, but all I have is those, since I didn't want to give a talk, but once I start talking, I talk too much. But so you can see there's only 2 more. Finding your true self in a clearly delineated, methodical 4-step model. The other one is the famous imitation of Christ, Imitatio Christi, a huge movement in Christianity, very influential. And here the idea is to mature, to become, to grow as a person is to become more Christ-like. So you define more or less what kind of person Christ is and how Christ would react in a certain situation. And the closer you get to this in your life, the more character or personality growth you have experienced from a Christian point of view. So in that model of the Imitatio Christi, personality growth is the Christification or Christ, to become more Christ-like. And the last model I want to mention is that by Eleanor Stump, which also basically goes back to St. Augustine and others, is the ultimate goal of human existence is to have union with God. So my heart cannot rest until it finds peace and solitude and quiet. I don't know even exactly how that is in English, Unruhig ist unser Herz, bis es ruht in dir. So restless is our heart. Does anybody know how that? Restless is our heart until it rests in God, or something like this. Yeah. So
I believe it's until it finds rest in God or something.
Finds rest in God. Yeah. So then character development or human growth is to get closer and closer to that situation where I completely rest in that relationship to God. So what we hope to experience in the afterlife, visio beatifica, the beatific vision of God, personality growth in this life is to get as close to this state of being in union with God as possible. And if you look at Eleanor Stump's books, for example, her Theodicy, Wandering in Darkness, her justification of evil in this world, that is that sometimes it does really help us in coming closer to that ultimate goal of human existence, to be in a close, loving relationship with God. And without suffering, we become so superficial. We are so absorbed in our very limited human ideas about well-being and what it means to lead a good life, that sometimes we need the suffering to be reminded that our ultimate goal of personality growth is to be a person who is deeply connected in an interpersonal relationship to God. So I call that the relational model of personality growth. This is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just what I could come up with to get this discussion started. And now I want to learn from you where you, after those first 3 months of the projects, where you as philosophers and theologians who are interested in Christian topics and who are now working on the psychological topic of personality growth, where you see the connection between that psychological concept of personality growth and Christian ideas of growth. And the floor is open to all of you. If you have ideas, if you want to add something, criticize something, what I said, and I just make sure that you see me again, close that. So whoever wants to say something, you don't have to raise your hands. And it's crucial for our project that we achieve something like an understanding, at least discuss this. How is this topic related to Christianity? I think that's exactly what Templeton had in mind with this project. Yeah, Aku.
Yes, thank you for that. This is a topic that has been on my mind lately, and I've thought about this. Coming from a Lutheran background, let's imagine a kind of hardcore Lutheran response. What would that be like? So, if one were a hardcore Lutheran, one would probably say something like this. Well, first of all, it's not really personality growth that happens in the Christian context. What happens is that you have the personality that you have, which is the completely corrupt and sinful personality. That needs to go. And you are kind of moving towards a new personality. But it's not necessarily a process of kind of linear development or anything like that. No, the old stuff has to go. And that is being kind of systematically destroyed by this new personality that God gives you. And this, first of all, it seems to me that changes the agency question. So it's not really up to you to develop your personality because you're completely corrupt. So the old personality has to go. And then the development is not necessarily linear, so it can be quite patchy in a way, because it is God who's acting upon you to create this new personality in you. And And if we take Luther literally, he seems to be saying that there are two persons in you. There's the old person and then the new person, and they coexist in you, and in very kind of metaphysical way.
The old Adam and the new Adam. Sort of.
Yes, the Christ and the old Adam, they exist at the same time, which means that you're at the same time kind of corrupt and sinful, but at the same time also justified. Because you have Christ living in you. So there are these two, this is kind of interpreted often quite metaphysically too. So you have, if we take this literally, I mean, not that many people do, but let's kind of run with the literal reading of it. This gives a specific kind of picture of personality growth. First, it's not something that you do. Second, it's not exactly growth, that you take something and then add things to it and remove things from it. No. What happens is a qualitative change. One thing turns into something else, and there's a kind of cut between those two. So would this be then something that creates an account of personality growth or something like that? Not necessarily, but I think it might give you an idea what that view might look like. So it might be quite critical towards these, let's say, more Catholic type of views where you learn virtues and things like that. So it's not a kind of linear development kind of view. It's quite something else. I don't know what to make of it, but that's, I don't know what you.
I will very quickly answer to this because I see many hands. So in positive psychology, we have this very positive view of the human person. Basically, if you put the human person in a nurturing, ideal development, he or she will turn out very nicely. We become a very beautiful, ethical, and whatever person, because the human person is intrinsically good, and it's only if he or she is in a bad environment, things go south. And that was often Catholic theologians thought had a certain closeness to those views because they have this more positive view. But then you see in the Ignatian model that in the end, to reach the first step, there is a radical abandonment of your ego. So something has to die, and something new has to grow out of the ashes. But maybe that's a more revolutionary model, but it still might be the model of the seed, so to speak. The seed also gets destroyed, but then a whole tree grows out of it. I don't know, Gina, have you been following who was first? I would say, otherwise I would just say Catherine, Hans, and Marcus in that sequence. Okay. So Catherine.
Okay, thanks. I think that's probably about right. Anyway, so I'm just getting the document where I wrote a couple of thoughts. So yeah, thanks, Godehard, for that. So it's really interesting thoughts. Now I was going to say something kind of similar to what Aku said about the idea, slightly though, just about the idea that to me, something kind of uniquely Christian that maybe departs from, what might be provable through empirical psychology, or is this idea of becoming more Christ-like. So the integration, virtue development, and finding your true self are all things that are psychologically understandable, but with a specifically Christian content. That uniquely Christian that might not be translatable is becoming more Christ-like, and relationship to God. But even there, even with relationship to God, there's a kind of analog in psychology to kind of relationship to something outside of yourself or to others or to the transcendent. But becoming more Christ-like is like something it seems to me uniquely Christian. And as Aku was saying, in certain Christian traditions, this is about not developing necessarily a part of yourself, but actually taking on the spirit of Christ, or as it's I think it might be 2 Corinthians talks about the mind of Christ, where you actually incorporate a strange external element from God that then becomes a part of you in a way that, you know, it's not you becoming more Christ-like, you are, but it's also you like fusing with Christ in a way that like he actually enters into you in the form of the Holy Spirit. And on the one hand, enables you to face your demons and decide what you really want in life and all this stuff. Like you are empowered through the Holy Spirit to do that stuff. But it's also, there's this foreign element in you that is the Holy Spirit. And that seems to me like a really uniquely Christian thing that's spiritual. And I don't know if there's any psychological analog, but it's something that I think is really important from a Christian perspective. So it's my initial thought.
Thank you. Thank you. Hans, Markus, and Buki in that sequence.
Sure, thanks. There's much that I can avow from the previous 2 responses, but just some thought on like the Eleanor Stump model, where the goal is like union with God or getting close to God. There's a reading of that goal that it doesn't really involve much personality growth. You're just put your mind to God and just leave the world as it is. There's no real transformation going on. It's rather leaving the world behind, or leaving your old self behind, and not really like doing much more, just abiding in the presence of God, much like in some contemplative orders was the case and is the case to some extent. So this union of God with God is only relevant for personality growth if it changes you, if it transforms you, maybe in the sense that Catherine and Agu just said. So there's more needed than just union with God, I would say, if you want to involve personality growth. Maybe growth in virtues, growth in kindness, growth in charity, and so on.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. The idea is if you do this, by doing this, so again, as a Jesuit, I quote St. Ignatius, he said, only very few people would know what God would make of them if they would completely hand themselves over to him. So, and so you really get change if you enter in that. That's a relationship. That's an internal relationship. It doesn't become, that's not external to you, but entering into this relationship deeply changes you as a person. Yeah, I think that's the idea.
One more thought. Well, it should, like in the ideal way, but there is a sense there has been people who just, they go to Mass, they go to Eucharist, maybe they get close to God, maybe they pray, but it doesn't change them. They just leave it till Sunday, and just the rest of the week they don't really mind or don't really have it transform their work anymore.
They compartmentalize, so to speak.
Yeah.
They have this. Okay. I think it was Markus now, and then Buki, and then Catherine, you have your, is it still up or again? Okay. So,
yeah. I wanted to comment on what Aku said, but combining it with Catherine said. So I think this could be a solution to the Lutheran question, or the Lutheran answer, maybe. So first of all, from a psychological perspective, nobody would agree that personality growth, somebody that can be from, let's say, outside, like from God, and it's from a psychological perspective, it sounds like fatalism, that you see yourself kind of as a victim who is just freed by God. So from a psychological or psychotherapeutic view, they always say that you have to work on it, and you really need to want it, and you long way, a hard way. So it's kind of surprising to see such a contrast. But with Catherine saying that it can be a fusion with God, that God is in yourself. And when it is God is in yourself and it's a fusion, you could also say, well, this is about you, it's about yourself. Yeah. So with God, you change yourself. So this could be kind of a solution. And now we could also question, who is yourself? Who is I? Yeah. And when we take a perspective from let's say, multi-systems view, like personality view, personality systems interaction, and there are others as well, we may ask the question, who is I? And as I showed that in PSI theory, but also in Buddhism, we have kind of the ego and the self. And it's interesting because here too, it's just in Buddhism, letting go of ghosts, letting go of the ego, and you find God. So when asking Julius Kuhl with Spiritual Intelligence, his book, he would answer the question, well, God is about finding yourself, about finding the self, activating the self rather than the ego. So
Can
I
I
see
just
some connections here.
Marcus, Marcus, just quickly, do you see a connection between the Buddhist idea that you have to get rid of the empirical ego and find your true self beyond your empirical ego and PSI, so the Buddhists claim that it's
let's say the Hinduist. It's not the Buddhist. It's
the Hinduist. It's the fundamental error that you identify with your empirical ego, and personality growth means that you understand that you are not your empirical ego.
Yeah, well, I don't know what you exactly mean by the empirical ego, but from PSI is very congruent in this regard with self-determination theory. So when it's about identities which are not truly integrated, introjected only, you should let them go, or to integrate them. Once they're integrated, you're fully autonomous. And maybe this is a state which you could equal with God, or saying that only with God you can reach it.
Thank you. Buki, Catherine, Ryan, and Aku. Buki, Catherine, Ryan, and Aku.
Thank you. Those were interesting thoughts. I don't know if I have much to share. What occurred to me as you were speaking, and where my research is beginning to go, is we focus so much on the individual, and yet we are social species. So sometimes some of these concepts, I think, are like virtue and personality, are particularly difficult to identify or delineate on a personal level. But they actually become more coherent, I think, when you look at communities or groups. And so I wondered if there is a way we could recognize that first. And second, the notion of Christ-likeness as well, I think sits sort of, as I see it, within that. Because the first people who were described as Christians were described as a group, and because they behaved, their group behavior seemed to mirror that of Christ. So it wasn't an individual phenomenon.
So you say it's relational, but not primarily in the relation to God, but relational in a shared experience of a group.
Yes, and maybe a dimension of that is socially realized. So because you're good, I'm good, if that makes sense.
Catherine, Ryan, and Aku is the sequence now. So.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to get back to the discussion a couple minutes ago about relation to God and Stump. Now, the suggestion was that relation to God doesn't necessarily need to go hand in hand with personality growth construed in any kind of way, because you can just rest in God without kind of developing. And then I think your response, Godehard, was that, well, the idea is that the presence of God actually does change you over time, and develops you in certain ways, because that's the way in which you become more Christ-like. The Holy Spirit does transform you when you let him in. I wanted to point out something else, and so another aspect of this relation to God issue that comes across in Eleanor's book, Wandering in Darkness. So I think she would agree with you, Godehard, that the presence of God does change you, and that's part of what it is to rest in God, is to open yourself up to transformation by him. But she also takes things and goes in slightly the other direction, and saying that the traumas and the suffering that you experience so suppose that you have not welcomed kind of Christ into yourself yet. She says one of the functions is probably the wrong word, but one thing that God can use suffering for is to kind of bring you to a state where you're like, God, I can't take it anymore. I need you, to kind of bring you to a state of quiescence, so that you then can let God in to do that transformative work to begin with. So if we're thinking about personality growth from trauma, on the one hand, the presence of God, once he's there, it changes you. But there's a certain amount of change that in some cases, if you're, that has to happen before you let God in at all. And that's on Stump's view is often change that comes through suffering, that God lets you get into certain situations in life such that they kind of push you or nudge you to open yourself up to him. And that in itself is the kind of growth that happens before God even enters the picture inside you. He pushes you to grow from traumas or to have traumas. Or maybe he pushes you to have the traumas so that you then grow from them when you do let him in. So there's that aspect of personality growth that happens, that you get kind of primed for growth by the trauma. So that's another aspect of Eleanor's view.
I see. Ryan and Aku.
Thanks. Just quickly first to follow up on Puki's comment, at least how I was understanding your comment about the idea of not just individual growth, but sort of group growth. This is something I take an interest in, and I think there's growing interest in among virtue theorists, and also room to sort of expand exploration of it using empirical methods too, to try to measure something like group virtues and see, that seems like an area where there's room for more research, and I think would be quite interesting to explore. My main comment was,
okay. Could you pinpoint typical Christian virtues, or would you say the personality? If personality growth is virtue growth, there is no proprium, nothing specific to Christianity. It's basically the same virtues that are being identified by psychology or philosophy, and there's no, Christianity per se has nothing to add to what the ideal person is in terms of virtues.
I think I could say something about that's sort of more relevant to the main thing I was going to say, but I can relate it to the group case too. So my main comment was going to be just, so we're supposed to be kind of talking about a Christian perspective on personality growth, and I think so far mostly we've talked about kind of unique Christian ideas about what growth might constitute growth, or what unique ideas about processes that might lead to growth. But I was wondering, I kind of wanted to raise this question really, can the Christian kind of recognize both like a couple of different kinds of growth, one that is more unique to the Christian paradigm for growth, and one that can be recognized as legitimate growth, but happens sort of by means that are not unique to Christianity, or growth in character traits that are not uniquely valued within Christianity. So like one place I was thinking that you might look to for this way of thinking is Aquinas's distinction between acquired and infused virtues. That perhaps there's a way, that's one way to do it, to recognize growth in some kind of trait of generosity that isn't conceptualized as having anything to do with God, and maybe there are mechanisms to grow in that trait that don't have anything to do with like resting in God or seeking to become Christ-like, that could be recognized by the Christian as involving genuine growth. And then there's also another idea of, well, there's a further growth. This sort of virtue, even a virtue like generosity, can be transformed when a person does rest in God. It's transformed into a different kind of virtue that has a further value, and there's a unique kind of process that's involved in that. So I guess the general question is just about, can you recognize two kinds of legitimate growth there?
Okay, in infused virtues would be like faith, hope, and charity, something like that.
Yeah, and then I guess I was also thinking you might have sort of infused versions of the other virtues too. So like my memory of this is not great, but I think Angela Noble has a nice chapter about this topic in this recent volume of Faith and Virtue Formation.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the background for the psychologist is here. Infused means that it needs the grace. It doesn't grow out of your own personality, so to speak, but it needs to be infused from the outside by an act of God, by the grace of God, which Akov made a strong case for, that Christian development is really, and that God interferes with my otherwise corrupt nature and infuses something new, and that leads directly to Aku, who was next on the list.
Thanks. So again, I keep pushing this radically Protestant line of argument. Not that I necessarily subscribe to it. I just want to keep pushing it because I think there's something that it wants to say. And again, first responding a little bit to Markus. So I think, yes, the kind of radical Lutheran idea is that every activity that you can come up with as a sinful human being is corrupt, and in the eyes of God is crap. And this is a radical view. It's not something that is easily kind of digestible or easily acceptable from a secular point of view. But this is the theological view. And it doesn't sound very pretty, but that's how it's presented. And this also connects to what Ryan to what Ryan said. So perhaps, again, a kind of strict Lutheran would say that there are two, let's say, axes of two ways of seeing the human being. One is seeing human beings in the light of other human beings. So from a kind of secular perspective. And from the secular perspective, there might be such things as personality growth, perhaps even some moral development, things like that. But seeing the human being from a divine perspective, from a God perspective of God, then there's nothing like that. So, and I think the hardcore Lutheran would say that what's wrong with the way that we talk about this now is that we tend to put these two things together. So we tend to say that when, from a divine perspective, of let's say kind of measurable, discernible from a human perspective development or something like that. But from a divine perspective, no. So what God is, what theology is mainly concerned about is the divine relationship, the human divine relationship, not the human relationship. And you can be, again, according to kind of traditional Lutheran view, you can be doing all sorts of moral acts that seem like very good acts in the eyes of other human beings. You might seem that it might seem to others that you're very selfless, that you're doing virtuous actions and all of that. and you might be kind of worthy of praise in the human eyes, so to speak, in the secular sphere. But at the same time, from a divine perspective, all those actions are crap. They are crap because they involve a certain kind of hidden assumption, a kind of hidden selfish premise, which is not discernible from any kind of measurable secular perspective. Again, a very radical theological view, but this is what they seem to be saying. These kind of traditional Lutheran thinkers. So in that sense, personality growth is not really something that the theology has an interest in thinking about. The interest is the divine-human relationship. And that divine-human relationship, and in that divine-human relationship, the human being is always just the recipient of God's goods. So God is the one who gives all the good stuff. And it flows from God to the human being without any kind of active part from the human being. And that might result into some measurable personality growth as it's seen by other people. But that's not a necessarily requirement of it, because what it changes is the kind of inward attitude that you have towards God, which makes your actions pleasing to God, because you have the right kind of relationship to God. Again, a very radical view, but this might challenge the idea that that theology is somehow kind of primarily engaged in an attempt to understand and try to somehow feed personality growth in this kind of secular sense.
I get it. I think there is a psychological parallel for this also in philosophy. The idea that you can be altruistic for egotistical reasons. So from the outside, you look very altruistic and praiseworthy, but from the inside, you do all of this just for yourself. And you want to be the altruistic person because you know you get the praise and so on. But that's not visible from the outside. So I think there is a secular or psychological or philosophical, as you know, there's a long-standing philosophical debate about the possibility of altruism. So I don't think this phenomenon that your inner state can, so to speak, spoil all the good you do from the outside is not entirely a theological thought. It can be translated into a secular thought as well. So I think I lost track. I think it was Hans, Markus, and Buki. Is that the correct, or is it Markus, Hans, and Buki? So it's Hans first, and Markus, and then Buki. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Benedict posted something in the chat, by the way, but we can look at that later. There seems to be two things coming up out of the discussion, like, is there something distinctly Christian qua content, different virtues, different kind of growth or different end goals, but also like the way you get there, like does it involve like an external divine agency taking over your ego, possibly destroying it? And on that last thing, there's like a corollary there, because if it's an external agency like helping you develop, helping you grow, it need not be slow. Like growth has often this connotation of being slow growth, steadily, gradually. But like in Christianity, there's also the story of conversion experiences, God breaking through, changing people radically and swiftly, very quickly. It seems to be lacking in secular accounts usually. So there might be something distinctly Christian or at least distinctly religious, like the speed with which it can go. For example, Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus or other experiences there that lead to a radical change very quickly.
Yeah, well, I could also answer to this from a psychological perspective. So there are long debates through decades in psychology about whether learning is actually a qualitative step or if it's continuous. So this is also related to what Aku said, that it's a sudden thing. And there is, for example, connectionism or neural network learning who can explain it. So you can see when you try to model it mathematically using neural networks that they have qualitative steps, but on another level, it looks like a linear step. So basically, it can kind of be integrated. And it is also, so for example, you might have what we have in psychology, you might call it an insight, yeah? Similar like a conversion, that's, oh my gosh, something happened. But then it may still take some time to implement the behavior to change the things. But on a mental level, so inside, something happened, let's say, or that you make a decision at one point, but then you may slowly implement it in behavior so that from an outer perspective, from a from an observer perspective, it looks like, okay, things change slowly, but there may be these phases, these conversions, insights, which are kind of moments, which are really critical. Kind of in chaos theory, you might call it bifurcation, where something changes into another direction. It may not show directly up in behavior. But myself, I just want to mention another thing, which is when we have this becoming like Jesus, it addresses a particular kind of learning in psychology, which is a model learning, that we learn after a model. So basically, Christians, but all other religions intuitively highlight with their heroes, with the idea of a hero, kind of a spiritual hero or teacher, important model. Yeah, a Freudian idea, it is the father. Yeah, when you model the father, everything will be fine, and you will be ill. Yeah, and not grow when you do not identify with the father. Those fathers have weaknesses because they are human, so it's good to have God and Jesus, who are real heroes and which you can easily model or easily adopt as a father, a true father, a strong father, reminding me of the idea Godehard's father, when you asked him, you are probably stronger than God. Okay, in short, it's a mechanism about how we learn. So the importance of model learning, that we have somebody, maybe Jesus at best, yeah, because he will never fail. It's an idea that we have in our mind, or maybe even a spiritual teacher, a good friend that who you copy, a YouTuber or whatever. So just saying, from a psychological perspective, personality growth can be facilitated when you have a model like Jesus.
Okay, so there is it's interesting that you get back to the Freudian point and my father all the times. It's left an impression on you. Anyway, I agree with that. So the Benedict wrote, because he's in the train and cannot speak, he says, the train is too loud to turn on my mic, but it seems that personality growth presupposes an essentialistic metaphysics of the human person. So the idea that the human person has a certain essence of metaphysical nature, and also that there is an ideal state concerning how a human person is supposed to be personality-wise, like the end of a journey, teleologically. If the ultimate goal is union with God or imitation of God, imitation of Christ, then growth in personality seems to be degrowth of the empirical ego. Oh, degrowth is not is that an English word? No. Is it an English word? Whatever, you understand what he means, then it's a shrinking, so to speak, of the empirical ego. So who else was? We have a few minutes. There was one hand up. Was it Buki? Yes. Yeah.
I think so, a couple of people have already anticipated some of what I was going to say. I think firstly I wanted to follow up on Aku's position from the Lutheran perspective. It reminds me of perhaps a proto personality growth paradigm put forward by Augustine, where he has it's very Neoplatonist. So it begins from the animatio level, from there, and it goes right up to contemplatio. But for him, I see what Akko meant, because a lot of the ethics sits on, I think, the third plane, which isn't, God isn't necessarily involved in that plane. After that, you give yourself to God for purity. And then the things that come in after aren't virtue as such. They're things like recognition of oneself, recognition of God, recognition of truth, and then ultimately contemplation of God. So I wondered if the thing I was going to pull out from there, though, is that though that plane where virtues sit is nonetheless necessary to arrive at the higher, perhaps the higher planes that mean something to God. And then the second thing I wanted to ask was going back to my idea of group virtues, is that virtues in themselves aren't, as I see them, they're not for the individual, because it's meaningless if I'm generous and I'm the only person in the universe. So I wonder if something that's built into virtue, the concept of virtues, is the idea of relation, and human to human relation in particular.
Thank you. So what one interesting question that just pops up in my mind now, Akko, I've seen that you raised your hand. So we've seen two models here. One is like the more Protestant one, and the other one is like the more Catholic one, even though they are not completely mutually exclusive, and there's all in-betweens. But one says that personality growth really requires not an evolution, but a revolution. Something old has to die and something new has to emerge. And the other model is more evolutionary and says, well, certain things that have been there all the time have to be nourished and have to grow. And the interesting question might be whether we can find empirical evidence for one of these models over the other. So, for example, in as I said before, in humanistic psychology, it is very often thought that human nature is ultimately very positive, and under the right conditions, it always develops very nicely and positively. And also in positive psychology, I think that's part of the idea. And other views in psychology are much more negative. And maybe this is even a project for empirical investigation, what growth really implies. Is it disruptive? Is growth necessarily disruptive, or is it more like a gradual change? Or do we have two different notions of growth here? Akko, yes.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Goethe that seems to be the kind of picture that can be drawn from the basis of the conversation. It's either evolution or revolution, and also the agency behind it. So what's the role of the what kind of agency is involved? Is it divine? Is it group agency? Is it individual agency? But to address some of the issues that Buki said was that, well, I mean, the whole tradition of virtue ethics, I think it's quite communal even from the beginning. So the virtues are moral virtues, and it doesn't really make any sense to talk of moral virtues without other people. So because morality has to do with how we relate to one another. So all these virtues that we talk about are ways of relating to other people, and they don't come from the individual by itself. It's the community is required for the production of individual virtue. So this is something that Alistair McIntyre already kind of mapped out very early on in thinking about virtue theory or virtue ethics. That we're always in communication with others, and we learn from others, and virtues are learned by this kind of model learning that Marcus talked about, not like learning rules, but adopting ideals and seeing how other people behave. That it's like learning wisdom rather than learning rules or things like that. So in that sense, I think the community is always there. Whether the community has its own virtues somehow as a whole, that's another thing, because it seems to me that this is a kind of difficult question about the agency of groups and the kind of social ontology of groups. So what do we think groups are? So what constitutes a group? Is a group an agent? And if it is, in what sense? So I think there's some divergence here as well in terms of views. But I'm just wondering about the content, the content of growth as well, because one of the assumptions, again, if one looks at this from a kind of radical Protestant perspective, one would say that the secular idea of what virtue is, or the secular idea of what a good life is quite different from what the good life ideal of a Christian is. So it might not be, the difference might be in the content of what a good life is supposed to be. Because from a secular perspective, one would say, well, it's a certain kind of success. Other people like you. You get a good job. You do well in life. You treat people well, and people like you. Well, that would be one. Or you exhibit some kind of mental health or physical health, things like that. You're smart and you're beautiful, basically, are popular. Well, a Christian view would be, well, that's all crap. That's not success in life. Success in life is devoting yourself to selfless pursuits and becoming more like God, in the sense that you don't care about whether other people think you're beautiful, or whether you're a success, or whether you have a good job, or whether you look if you look good. None of that matters. What matters is your kind of moral and spiritual fiber, which is not measured from the divine point of view. Your kind of virtues are not measured by your success or things like that. So it would be, so the theological view should be, I think, more critical. And this is, again, I think, something that a theologian might, a kind of accusation that a theologian might direct towards positive psychology. I'm kind of shooting with a big cannon here now, so you understand. So but the kind of point that I'm trying to make is that a theologian might want to be a little bit more critical towards positive psychology in the goals, in terms of the goals that the positive psychology is trying to get to, and there might be some. Well, let's say that the theological idea might be more radical than what positive psychology would allow or would want. And it might also look like not necessarily mental illness, but might not look like mental health from a secular perspective. Again, a radical idea, but I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, I think that was very interesting, and bringing it really, you made it the difference in evaluating the lives very, very clear in your hypothetical positive psychologist and your hypothetical Protestant theologians. Well, Ruben made it. Did your presentation go well, Ruben?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Even Uwe Meixner liked it.
Yeah, he was very friendly and he liked it very much. Yes.
Okay. Because in his committee is Uwe Meixner. Some of you know him, and he basically has two grades, A and F, and there's nothing in between. And it's always tough to be on the A side. Yeah, I think that's basically, I think that was a helpful discussion as far as I'm concerned on how we relate to the topic of our research as Christians and what the possible connections could be. I think we have to keep that in our minds constantly, and we wanted to bring it to the forefront here explicitly in this meeting. But as far as I'm concerned, we can leave it at that, and we don't have to do 19 minutes all the time. What do you think, Gina? I think that has been a fruitful discussion, and we can just have a nice weekend after this, all of us.
Yeah, definitely it was really fruitful. Well, one of the questions that I will ask everyone, and I think you can think about this, is how to build bridges between these two big perspectives. And I see here from everything you said, I see some issues, especially with the phenomena of self-infiltration, and how I have to allow God to enter me. And then, so in this case, I will see psychology and this view of theology a bit opposed. So I will say some of the things that we discuss here, like building healthy relationships, the benefit of the group, this is something we can like build a bridge between these two perspectives. Maybe we should focus in this kind of things where we can really find this connection. And obviously these other critical points are there, and we have to acknowledge them. And today it was, for me, I realized a lot of things, but at the same time, I believe Templeton is really interested in finding a way to build a bridge, and then maybe conducting empirical research in these kind of topics where there is a connection between these two views.
Yeah,
so
I
maybe
agree.
something to think about.